Hi everyone. So I want to go over reports with you briefly to make sure everybody understands the project, to make sure everybody understands what's expected of you, and to clarify things in the book that you might miss that are really important. So we're going to work on reports next, and reports are really important at work. You make reports all the time for two reasons. You're either keeping a record of something, which becomes like legal documents, or you're trying to communicate something to your boss or somebody else at the company, or both. So in an informational report, which you may have done even at a retail job, there's kinds like incident reports where somebody gets injured on the job and you have to fill out a form saying when they got injured, how they got injured, how you treated them, so on and so forth. That's a legal record in case you get sued or whatever of how that person got injured and when. And it also may be passed up the chain to say, like, this area of our company, people keep getting injured, so maybe we should do something, right? That's an example of an information report. You're just passing information. This person got injured at this time. Okay, and you might, for example, people who work for environmental companies, imagine that somebody is sent to test the water to find out how much of a harsh chemical is in the water. They go ahead and test the water, and then they write a report saying this is how much of the harsh chemical was in the water, which is both a legal record of how much was in the water at that moment in time, but also can be passed up the chain to people who need to make decisions based on that information. So that's an information report. You guys are going to focus on recommendation reports, which is you gather information and then you have to make a recommendation for the company. Those can be small recommendations. For example, your book focuses on an example of a printer, but those are real, and that happens a lot. Like, for example, my husband is a computer programmer. He's a computer engineer technically, but he programs for a living. And when his company, they would get computer chips from another supplier and then program them and put the computer chips in their equipment. That company went out of business. So they needed to figure out where to get computer chips from. Well, he's the computer engineer, so they put it up to him to research what options there were, what they would cost, what the specs were, so on and so forth, and then he had to say, this is where I think we should get the chips from, which was a really huge decision when you think about how much money the company was going to spend, but he was really the best qualified at the time to make that decision because he was the primary programmer, and so it was up to him to write that report, even though you might think, I'm not going to write at work, I'm a programmer. That's not how it works. You will write at work. Okay. And then you can have bigger, like more consequential recommendations, like recommending to shut down an entire department, recommending to merge two different departments, recommending to make a huge change at the company, or it's not just like, should we buy this printer, but something much bigger. But whatever you're asked to do at work, it's going to be something related to your expertise more than likely. You're being asked to do it because they think that your opinion on this issue is trustworthy. Right? So it's going to be related to your job, but you might be asked to make a recommendation at work. And that's what we're going to practice doing. Now, regardless of the length of a regardless of the length of a report, and a report can be anywhere from like 2 pages to 30 pages, right? Regardless of the length, they always have the same sections. So this is still good practice. If it's longer, it's because you did more research, have more to report, and more recommendations to make. So for example, in the engineering version of this class, engineers typically write longer reports at work, so they practice writing a really long report where they do multiple kinds of research, not just surveys, but like finding research, so on and so forth, and they might write like a 20-page report. You guys are going to practice writing a shorter one, and all you really did was collect surveys. You can use secondary research, let me just say really quickly, in this report. So for example, if you went to a website at FIU to learn more about the app you're studying, if you want to quote that website, that's secondary research. You went somewhere and read something. you can definitely quote that, just cite it, okay? If you looked anything up on the internet related to what you were studying and you want to talk about that in your report, you definitely can talk about it in your report. You just have to cite it. Okay, so anyway, you guys are just writing a shorter version because basically all you did was survey, so you shouldn't have that much data to report. So 1.5 to 2 pages, single space block paragraphs should be plenty. If when you write your report, when you write your report, if you answer all the questions you should answer, you should get pretty close to the word count without very much effort, okay? Now, if you write your report and you are short, that is a pretty good indication that you did not explain things enough, okay? So what I'm going to go over now is what you should be explaining in each of these sections so you understand how they really, really work, okay? I also don't want you to go over. I don't want you to go way, way over because I want you to learn how to deliver information quickly and easily, okay? So you are not going to just explain something to death because that's not good technical writing. You want to make sure they get the information, that they understand the information, but not just go over it and over and over it again, okay? All right, so these are how the sections work. Typically, students do worse on the introduction and methods section, believe it or not, even though they seem the easiest. But possibly because they seem the easiest, students put in a little bit less effort. I'm not really sure. The introduction does a couple of things. Imagine most people at your job will not know what you studied, but even if they do, they won't know what you did and what you found. So you really have to explain everything, and you get in this headspace sometimes where you know what you studied, you know what you found, and it's hard to remember to explain it all to somebody else. In the introduction section, you're going to explain not just what you studied and why, but explain to us what we need to know to understand the importance of the issue. So for example, if you studied an app or a website, you want to not just explain to me what you studied about that app or website and why, but you want to help me understand the importance, like what is this, why do we care if this app is working or not? And then you also want to explain to me anything I need to know to understand the study, like when was this app written? When was it rolled out? Is it mandatory? That kind of thing. If it's a website, is this a recent redesign of the website? Is this an old website? What is this website used for? How is it supposed to work? Those kinds of questions. You set that all up in the introduction. You should also think of the introduction, that's what you're doing on the surface, but what you're doing underneath in like sort of unspoken terms is you're also justifying why you set out to research this. You just spent company time researching this. Why was that worth studying? Okay, so what did you study? Why is it important? What do I need to know about the thing you studied? And also, like, what have you been doing with your time? Okay, and then in the method section, you're going to explain how you set out to study it. In this case, you might say not just how you set out to study it, why you use those methods. So in this case, you might say, like, I did surveys because my teacher told me to, but pretend that's not the case. And then also remember, I told you to pick a topic that you thought you could answer with surveys. So you really still have to justify why you thought that topic could be answered with surveys, okay? But what did you do? How many people did you survey? How did you get the surveys to them? What program did you use to establish the surveys? So on and so forth. And again, there's like the surface level. I'm explaining what I did and how I did it and why I did it that way. But again, on the like sort of underneath level, you are kind of justifying, again, number one, what have you been doing with your time at work? And number two, you're justifying the value of your data. Because if I do not believe that you really tried to collect good data, or if I do not believe that this was a good way to collect data, then you're kind of saying anything I explain in the next section is not worth reading, right? If I'm like, you asked 5 people and that's how you got data, like this means nothing to me, right? You have to convince me that whatever conclusions you came up with are based on real, earnest research, okay? So that's the introduction and the methods. Then you have the results section. In the results section, you're going to literally explain your results. But importantly, not your conclusions, okay? So in that section, you can say, you know, we asked people this question in number 2, 37% of people said no, so we think that means X, you know, so on and so forth. But you will not say in the results section, therefore we think we should change the app in this way. Therefore we think those are conclusions and recommendations. So you're walking me through what the data says without interpreting it on your own. Another way to think of the results section is you want to prepare me for your conclusions and recommendations so that when you say, therefore we think that we need to advertise this more, or therefore we think that we need to make such and such changes, when I get to that section, I'll say, yeah, that makes sense. I read the data and I was kind of thinking the same thing. If I get to your recommendations and I'm like, whoa, what? How did you even get there? Then you have not done a good job in the results section, okay? And the results section is setting me up for the conclusions that you're about to draw and the recommendations you're about to make. An important note about organization: you don't have to go over every single question, though you might go over nearly every question. And you do not probably want to organize it chronologically. Like, this is what question 1 was, this is what question 2 was, this is what question 3 was, this is what question 4 was. You're going to organize it based on your biggest conclusions being gone over at the beginning of the section to least important evidence. And then you're also going to organize it in a way that makes sense logically. So, for example, if when your group got together to discuss the survey, your group was like, oh man, in number 2 they said this, and in number 10 they said that, and if I think about number 2 and number 10 together, this helps me understand, well, that's the way you're going to report it in the report too. You're going to go, this is what they said in number 2, and in the same paragraph, this is what they said in number 10, so together we think, right? So you're going to explain things in a logical order, starting with the most important data to the least important data in the results section. You are going to have images in the section, but I'm not going to talk about that here. I'm going to talk about it in the next video, and I will talk a little bit more about results in that video. And I'll go over the difference between results and conclusions again in that video. Okay, so let's say I went through it and I was like, okay, based on this data, to use the food bank example, based on question number 2 and number 10, we don't think students even know that FIU has a food bank. That is data, okay? I explained to you how number 2 plus number 10 helps me understand that FIU students generally don't even know that FIU has a food bank. Okay, in the conclusions and recommendations section is where I would really say, like, we've concluded that the advertising for the food bank is not very good. And we recommend, and then you would explain what your recommendations are for fixing that problem, right? What do you want to do to fix the advertising? What specifically? Fix the advertising is not a recommendation. What specifically? Do you want to buy pamphlets? Do you want to have it advertised on the website? What exactly are you trying to do to fix the problem you identified? So the results section reports the data and gets me prepared for the conclusions and recommendations. Now, the conclusions and recommendations can be 2 separate sections, or it can be 1 section. It doesn't really matter. It's your choice, okay? The difference between a conclusion and a recommendation is a conclusion is what does it mean, or what is the problem here specifically that you think is happening. And then the recommendation is what are we going to do about that, okay? So think of it like with the food bank example, a conclusion is the advertising isn't working effectively. And then a recommendation is, what are we going to do about that advertising? Some people would answer those together and kind of go through that. Shuffled in. Some people would write all of their conclusions. We think the advertising isn't working effectively. We don't think there's enough shifts to cover when people really go to the food bank. We don't think the location of the food bank is very good. And then go over their recommendations. We think we should do this to fix the advertising, this to fix the shifts, and this to fix the location. Okay? So that's the general gist of the report. Now, they always have those sections and they will always work in that order. It's up to you to figure out, what do I need to say in each section for my specific report. I think that the chapter is very helpful to you in terms of understanding what those sections do and remembering what I'm saying here. I will say, as a brief aside, I think that the questions listed for the introduction in your chapter are really good, but you do not have to answer every single one of those questions. They're just a really good way of thinking about the kinds of things that go in the introduction. But you don't have to answer every single one. But the book is a really good resource, and there are example reports. And even, I do not want you to copy the reports, but if you read them, you can kind of see the information that's being included in each of the sections. But hopefully this video has helped you to understand what you're doing here. Now, I just spent 15 minutes explaining what's going in the report, so you might think 2 pages, single-spaced, 1,000 words, that sounds like a lot. There's a lot that goes in it, okay? So, again, if you're not meeting the word count, there's probably something that you did not explain well enough. So go back through and think about what you need to explain better. And it is really important to consider your audience in this. Imagine that they don't know anything about what you did to find the answer, what you found, and what you're going to recommend. Make sure they understand all of those parts so that the data is useful to you. As a last aside, I'll say technical documents should stand on their own, meaning that I shouldn't have to read your report and then walk over to your desk and ask you to explain it to me. Or I shouldn't read your report and then walk over to your desk and say, can you tell me more about how you tested this? I should be able to read the report and understand that completely, okay? And you also need to think about the audience in the sense that you need to say it in a simple, direct way. It is easier for people to understand a sentence that has simple words, that is 10 words long, than a complex 30-word sentence with really big words in it. That is not thinking about the reader's needs. It's being a little bit of a show-off rather than thinking about what the reader needs, okay? The other thing I'll just say as a brief aside that comes up a lot in reports is that vocabulary really, really gets in the way, but mostly because the bigger the word, the less precise the meaning in a lot of ways. So I use this example sometimes. A house, for example, is a simple word. It's just a house. A house is only a house. A building could be a house. It could be some hospital. It could be any other thing. A structure can be a building, but a structure could also be like a tent, right? So when you start using those kinds of words, you're actually getting more and more abstract in your meaning sometimes. And if you string a bunch of those words together, I don't understand what you're trying to say anymore. Whereas if you just went with the simpler word, a house, that's actually much more specific. So think about that when you're writing. Say these things in a simple and direct way. I'm not saying use slang. I'm not saying be informal. I'm just saying don't go tripping over yourself to use really impressive vocabulary and have really complex sentences, because that does not make for effective writing. Okay, I just want to know what you studied and why. I want to know how you did it. I want to know what you found out. I want to know what you think it all means, and I want to know what you recommend about that. Okay, and just again, sorry, the last thing, you don't have to recommend you actually do something. You can recommend, you might find in your research that everything is working great and you recommend nothing. You recommend that you just keep doing the same thing. You can also recommend more research, like we answered all these questions, but one big question that is still looming before we can make a recommendation is X. So we recommend that we do a study to find the answer to X before we answer this question. Okay, so hopefully that's made everything clearer to you. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. Next, we're going to talk about graphics, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the results section. But you can actually go ahead and start drafting the report if you want. But next week, you're going to get a work day to work on the report. So it's up to you how you want to do that. But remember, so you can probably start drafting the introduction and methods right now, but you're not going to start drafting the results and conclusions, obviously, until after you've met with your group to talk about those things. Okay? Let me know if you have any questions.